Hey guys, today I'm going to compare Diablo 4 and Path of Exile 2 side by side. I'm going to be looking at each game in its current state, meaning Season 8 of Diablo 4 on the left versus the early access patch 0.1.1 of Path of Exile 2 on the right. I will break down each game into several categories and assign each game a score of 1 to 10 in each category. Now, I'm not going to tally the scores at the end in an attempt to give a definitive answer on which game is better, because honestly, these categories are way too subjective. There are a lot of different types of gamers out there who may care way more about one thing than the other. Again, these are going to be my opinions, and you're probably not going to like them, but I love both games, and I love them for different reasons. Yes, they're both ARPGs, but for me, each game scratches a different itch. Let's get into it. A lot of people don't care at all about the story or campaign in ARPGs, but some people do. The Diablo 4 base game started out very strong in this category, and it might be my history of being a Diablo Andy for about 25 years now, but everything from the cinematics, the voice acting, pacing of the campaign, everything was on point, had me in my feels, and it really felt like the story was the only complete part of the game on launch. When Vessel of Hatred dropped, I was really excited to expand the story, but they kind of left us on this cliffhanger that soured me big time. I felt like they're just milking us for no reason whatsoever. It just wasn't finished. If we would have had some resolution or big payoff at the end of Vessel, I would have given this a much higher score, but because of that, as of Season 8, I'm giving Diablo 4 a 6 out of 10 for story. Now, talking about the campaign in PoE 2, I will remind everyone that I am aware that we have only half of the story so far, but I will say, as far as the story itself goes, I'm just not that into it. That might be just a me thing, and Path of Exile 1 players may be getting the feels like I was in Diablo, I'm not really sure, but I found out myself by skipping the dialogue, very early in the campaign was just kind of my go-to, and because there's no campaign skip after completing it once, you have to do the campaign over and over again with each new character, so there's plenty of chances to pay closer attention before release if you plan on playing more than one character. And I did. My second playthrough, I paid a little more attention, and there is good voice acting. The dialogue isn't really cheesy. It's pretty good, actually. The boss fights make up for the lack of story in most places, so yeah, I mean, it is solid. I'm giving PoE story so far a 5 out of 10 based on the current state of early access. Alright, let's talk about the graphics of each game, and I'll give you a side-by-side here. Now, obviously, the cinematics you just saw for both games are a 10 out of 10. But I'm more talking about the look of the characters, the environments, the spells, the bosses, graphics, right? Diablo 4's graphics are more cartoony than PoE 2, but I really like how the game looks, and of course this category is extremely subjective, like they all are really. But I personally think that it looks great, and I like how they kept some of the colorful elements from Diablo 3, but also toned them down just a little bit. So as far as ARPGs go, before PoE 2 came out, Diablo 4 by far had the best graphics of any of the competition. The open world is beautiful, the spell effects are awesome, the zones are mostly creative, and it currently seems to run very smooth. I will admit, in some situations, especially when there are other players out in the open world, it does get a little hard to tell what's going on. It's pretty messy, but that's true to some extent for both games. But I give the graphics for Diablo 4 a 7 out of 10. On the other hand, PoE 2 looks like what I originally wanted Diablo 3 to look like. It seems more like Diablo 3 than Diablo 3 did, and to me that's a good thing. The graphic quality is very similar to Diablo 4, but slightly more crisp and gritty. Didn't even really notice this until I went back to D4 for Season 8. But anyway, for PoE 2, the maps look incredible, spell effects look glorious, bosses are menacing, and overall, I think GGG nailed it, and I give Path of an Exile 2 an 8 out of 10. Alright, let's talk about the UI and the menus. I wanted to keep the UI category separate from graphics since the look of the UI is really only about half of it. The other half is the ease of use, the intuitiveness, and the overall polish of the menus. I know that some people don't care at all about this, But let's look at a side-by-side of a few different things. First off, let's take a peek at the skills. Diablo 4 on the left gives us a skill tree that's extremely easy to understand and navigate. You know exactly what's possible and how to do it. If you look on the right at PoE 2, while the skill system itself is much more robust, and we'll talk about that later, it doesn't look quite as polished as Diablo. Might just be me. It's not very intuitive, even though once you get used to it and start clicking on some of these arrows, it actually provides more details than Diablo 4 does. It's just not very intuitive. In Diablo 4, the game menus, the skill icons, the character screen, even the shop, which I didn't even want to mention at all have a little more polish than PoE 2 does. One thing I like better about PoE 2 is the different types of stash tabs, and I like that experience better than Diablo 4, but Diablo 4 has better search and sorting functions with their basic and limited tabs. So it's a little back and forth there. And again, this will be a perfect time to reiterate that I'm very aware that PoE 2 is in early access. I mean, hell, they already had an update to some Waystone icons based on just a little feedback, so I know they're not done making improvements. With all that being said, I give the UI in Diablo 4 an 8, while I give the UI for PoE 2 a 6. Alright, let's talk about the world for a second. I almost just included this in the graphics section, but I thought I'd dive slightly deeper and talk more about the mechanics of the world as opposed to just the look, especially for those not familiar with either game and might be trying to make a decision on which one to play. Diablo 4 did something that no other ARPG had done before, and that was build an entire open world for us to explore. It's big, it's beautiful, the map itself looks great, even though it's a little convoluted, especially if you don't know what you're looking at. The problem with the open world is that it seems almost like a half-baked idea. They started to go in one direction, built this entire open world to explore, but when people started playing it, the players realized they just wanted to be able to teleport everywhere or instantly join dungeons and spend more time blasting. So thankfully they made some changes to that because nobody liked running to every single nightmare dungeon, for example, but it ultimately left them with like a fractured product. I do like the Season 8 mechanic similar to a couple of, previous seasons of turning zones into special zones and running around them openly. Does feel great. But I almost felt like the open world was unnecessary at this point, and I have reason to believe having an open world like this makes it tougher to do, changes or fixes, maybe harder than it needs to be. Bank tabs, anyone? On the other hand, PoE 2 took the formula of the old Diablo games and everything is instanced. You run individual, randomly generated maps and you deal with a loading screen in between environments. And honestly, this doesn't bother me at all, even after playing Diablo 4 with the open world. And I don't really miss the world from Diablo 4 when I'm playing PoE 2, and I feel like it's easier to change or update the game in this type of coding environment as well. Kind of a guess, but it makes sense. And honestly, the quote unquote town in Act 2 of PoE 2 is one of the coolest towns in any game I've ever played. It's basically a moving caravan. Absolutely stunning. But anyway, outside of Act 2 being a little confusing on how and when to navigate to the different areas, the system works and I can't wait to see what Acts 4 through 6 look like. So with that being said, I give both games an 8 out of 10 for world or environment. All right, let's move on to gameplay or combat. What I'm talking about here is how it feels to play the characters, like the responsiveness, how it feels to press buttons, the chunk, you know what I'm talking about. And honestly, again, super subjective, but I think both games play extremely well. My first PoE 2 character was the warrior, so if I hadn't also played the monk and ranger, I'd probably give the game a much lower score than Diablo 4. Kinda clunky, but I realized immediately upon retiring the warrior around tier 8 maps and firing up a monk that it was a warrior problem, not a PoE 2 problem. Seriously though, both games feel absolutely amazing to play. The visuals, the sounds it makes, responsiveness, the dodge rolling. Honestly, I went back to D4 for Season 8 and I really hated the cooldown on the evade on most boots, so maybe that needs a revisit. But other than some of the annoying stuns I get that feels more like lag in PoE 2, both games get a 9 out of 10. Alright, let's talk about the music and audio in general. I had these broken into separate categories originally, but the scores ended up being the same, so I combined them for brevity. Both games have a music score that may be some of the best I've ever heard in a game. Some of my love for the old Tristram Diablo music made me appreciate the way the devs were able to capture that nostalgic feeling of past Diablo games. And honestly, before playing PoE 2, I didn't think they had a chance to match the music. And frankly, the overall sounds of Diablo 4, but I was wrong and pleasantly surprised. The spell sounds, the monsters dying, the voice acting, the overall score, and how each track complements the game in their own ways, absolutely awesome. And I'm going to give my first 10 out of 10 to both games. Well done. Both studios killed it.
My demons are quiet here. Mostly.
Alright, well, now let's talk about which game is better for casuals. And by casuals for this exercise, I'm talking about people with limited playtime, not necessarily people with limited skills. I think sometimes those two categories overlap, but most of the time, most skilled gamers who just don't have the time to play as much as they'd like are considered casual. I fit into that category, so take that into consideration when you're hate commenting my takes. I'll also use the next two categories to flesh out the early and the late endgame as well. Diablo 4 has had its ups and downs as far as respecting a player's time, but in its current state, there's no question that Diablo 4 caters to the casual crowd much more than PoE 2 does. But here's the thing, I was completely expecting PoE 2 to be unapproachable like the first game was often considered, but it wasn't. I mean, do they respect your time? Absolutely not. They basically give you two middle fingers to the face about your time. But I had fun getting into the game and trying to figure it out without the help of guides or content creators telling me exactly how to play the game. And it worked. I felt like the progression or learning curve wasn't too extreme. And this is coming from someone who went in blind playing a warrior, and I was able to make it through the campaign and into the early endgame without any guides or help or anything like that. After about 80 hours. But I bet half of that time was spent in town trying to figure things out and gambling on gear and rerunning certain zones I couldn't finish in one session if, like, real life stuff popped up. In Season 8 of Diablo 4, I was max level and into the early endgame in about 4 hours, and I wasn't trying to go fast. I had 90% of the gear I needed for the build I was going for, and I was in Torment 3 crushing everything in under 10 hours of play. Diablo 4 gives you the illusion of this massive endgame experience on the surface, and what I mean that Diablo 4, when you get to Torment 1 or the early endgame, there are a bunch of things you need or you can do to progress. There's the pit level, the pit to level glyphs, nightmare dungeons and infernal hordes for master working materials, hell tides for boss materials, root holds and corrupted zones for seasonal stuff, and all the battle pass things, the different bosses for certain uniques, etc. However, in the late endgame, if you want to call it that, the only thing to do is possibly bosses for, unique upgrades, and then to see how high of a pit you can clear. And that's it. You can get there in under 20 hours if you know what you're doing. And then there's PoE 2's early endgame. Just has maps. But before you get all crazy on me, there's way more to sink your teeth into within the mapping system, and the different activities are built into the map system itself instead of each thing like bosses or breaches, living on their own. It just all works together, and you could spend hundreds or thousands of hours from early to late endgame progressing your gear and character a little bit at a time, trying to reach max level, trying to push yourself into higher and higher maps. A lot of this has to do with the itemization and the way that gear works, and we'll talk about that next or soon. And not to mention how punishing PoE 2's endgame is. I mean, when you die, you lose basically everything good about the map you're on. You lose any gear still laying on the ground. You lose XP. I mean, it's like GGG looked me straight in the eyes, all serious, and says, just F you, freak. So I could keep going and going and going about the casual versus blaster experience. We'll talk about blasters next, but the early endgame versus late endgame experience between the two, there's a lot to talk about there, but I have to cut this off somewhere. So for casual gamers, I give Diablo 4 a 7 out of 10, and I give PoE 2 a 3 out of 10. All right, but before you rage quit the video because you are staunchly team PoE, let me talk about the blasters for a minute. I think that both games have a place for both casuals and blasters. In the current state, remember we're talking about the current state of each game, but let's be honest, the blasters can milk almost all the content in a Diablo 4 season in like a stream or two. They know what they're doing, they go fast, they go hard, and they gobble up the content before most players even log in over the week. PoE, on the other hand, can keep these types of players busy for an entire season easily. I thought about just reversing the casuals rankings for the blasters and the casuals, but honestly, that doesn't do PoE 2 justice considering their early game is better than Diablo's late game, respectively. I give Diablo 4 a blaster score of 2 and a PoE 2 a blaster score of 8. Again, this is in the current state, and I can't even imagine what PoE is going to look like when it's fully released with all of the characters and all of the ascendancies. I fully expect any future scores in this category to be a strong 10, and I can't wait to see what happens. All right, last but not least, let's talk about items or itemization. Well, what does that mean? The internet says, in games, itemization refers to the system of designing and implementing a variety of items that players can collect and use, each with unique attributes and functions, allowing players to customize their character's abilities and playstyle by strategically choosing which items to equip throughout the game. Essentially, it's the process of creating and managing different items within a game that impact gameplay significantly. So these two games take on a drastically different approach to itemization. Again, I'll be discussing the current state of each game, not what it was like when Diablo launched or what direction PoE may go with some of the issues the community has uncovered thus far, which I'm guessing will be addressed quickly. Like being too RNG-ish or gambly, or whatever you want to call it. Diablo 4 focuses on more certain powers and relies heavily on multipliers that are required to progress through the game. The game is balanced around these multipliers, and in order to continue to progress, the player has less and less options to choose from to be able to solve how to further progress. It's almost like if you don't have this specific item, your build does not work. Diablo 4's drops feel more controlled. The baseline tends to be decent, but it lacks those wild and extremely powerful high rolls that give PoE 2 that extra zhuzh. On the plus side, you do spend less time sifting through useless items. On the other hand, you rarely get that jackpot feeling. D4 lets you improve items in a predictable way, re-rolling specific affixes, applying aspects, using masterworking for guaranteed boosts, etc. It's reliable, but low thrill, and while I do think aspects can be cool, especially if there was a lot more of them, most builds end up stacking all the same ones, and it seems to remove a lot of meaningful choice, reducing variety. Both games have uniques, but D4s are much more common and can feel required for a lot of builds to function. In PoE 2, the drops have a slower climb from white to magic to rare, but the top end rolls can be incredibly strong. You'll often see the stats for all classes on all gear bases, which some people love and some people hate. PoE 2 uses different currencies like Chaos, Exalted, and Val orbs to gamble on adding or changing stats on gear pieces. This can be extremely exciting or wildly frustrating. In my experience, the latter was about 98% of the time, and considering the feedback from the community, I'm guessing some changes are on the way because although the itemization ultimately feels better in PoE 2, the RNG feels really, really bad, man. Now, skill gems, support gems, and gem sockets create deep opportunities to tweak and make custom builds. You feel every power up when your gem levels increase or you add a new support gem. It's definitely a layered and robust system that many players love. It just needs some tweaks to give the player a little more agency instead of feeling like it's required to use the trade website. Honestly, when I learned how to use the trade website, it kind of ruined everything for me because instead of playing the game and using my exalted orbs, even though I knew it was just my choice, I still just kept them and started buying items with them off the site. There's kind of a, in the mid into getting more into Endgame, you kind of hit a wall a little bit, and you can get some pretty good items for just one exalted orb. So in a nutshell, PoE 2 thrives on high risk, high reward crafting and deep skill customization, while Diablo 4 offers steady upgrades, easier control, and simpler but more vanilla progression. I think each system has their merits, but in my opinion, ultimately, PoE 2's system is more robust and has the most potential to give players the ability to be creative. As I mentioned before, in Diablo you can basically have all the items you need to clear in the game, and to clear the game in 10 to 20 hours for most players, less for the sweats. In PoE 2 you can spend hundreds if not thousands of hours perfecting and tweaking your build. Deciding which system is for you will depend on personal preference, what type of gamer you are, and how much time you want to spend in each game each season. Again, I like both and will be playing both most likely every season unless I get sucked into something else for a bit, but ultimately, I'll probably be playing both of these games for quite a while. So with all of that being said, I give the itemization in Diablo 4 a 6, and I give the itemization for PoE 2 in its current state an 8. In conclusion, both games are great games for different reasons. Many people seem to have chosen one or the other, but I don't see any reason not to be able to play both games. I really hope the seasons leapfrog each other so I can play every Diablo season for maybe a couple weeks, and then spend a month or so in each PoE season, so on and so forth. I do play other games and other types of games, so for me, it's actually a good thing when I run out of content in a seasonal game like this. I mean, as long as I got some enjoyment out of it, I'm happy. And, there's always next season. And of course, if you appreciate the video, consider dropping a like and subscribe. It really, really helps me out. Put a lot of effort into this one. Did all the editing myself. Hope you liked it. Thanks, guys. Till next time.